Hi friends, welcome to the Sis Live Your Best Life podcast show. I'm your host Denise, and I'm just a girl who had big hopes and dreams and decided to chase after them with everything I had in me, and I radically changed my life. And guess what? I'm just like you. Anyone can change their life, and that's what this show is all about. So what are you waiting for, sis? Are you ready to change your life? Let's do this. Hi friends, I want to talk a little bit today about my dad. So if you've seen some of my other videos, you know that my father passed away February 5th of 2022 from pancreatic cancer. So a little back history about my dad. When I was 10 years old, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Back then it was commonly known as manic depression. And as a child, I didn't really understand what that meant. I just knew that my dad had a lot of mental health issues, and he wasn't the kind of dad that I wanted and needed him to be. And not understanding, what all that meant. Now, my mom, she tried to help us understand, but I was only 10. And so not understanding what all of that meant, I had there was a lot of ups and downs with my dad over the years. He wasn't, even though he lived in our home, he wasn't fully present with us all the time because of all the mental health issues that he was facing. And, over the years, that really kind of built up some resentment in my life. And it wasn't because I didn't love my dad or he didn't love me, just because he wasn't there when I always needed him to be. And, this went on as I got into adulthood and stuff. It just got to where it wasn't unusual to go 4, 5, 6 months without hearing from my dad. And usually I didn't hear from him unless he wanted something or unless it benefited him in some way. And that, as I was in adulthood, really started to build up resentment in my heart. And I wanted him to be a part of my life, and he just didn't want to be. And I can still remember being in my late 30s and early 40s, calling my mom up, crying on my birthday, wanting to know why dad didn't love me enough to even call me and tell me happy birthday. And I remember one year I said, "But Mom, how can he not know when I was born? I was born 11 weeks early, y'all. I weighed 2 pounds and 13 ounces and this was back in 1974. And so, I couldn't understand, how can you forget that your child who was born 11 weeks early, how can you forget and not, or just not want to call them on their birthday? I couldn't understand that. And that really, really put some deeper resentment in my heart. And finally, when I was about in my mid-40s, I got to the point where I resolved myself that I was done chasing after him and trying to make him want to be a part of my life when he clearly didn't want that. Because like I said, months would go by and I wouldn't hear from him. And so I moved out to, Las Vegas in February of 2021. That's a whole story. I'll go into that in another video after I wanted a different life, came out here. But anyway, about a month later, my dad called me and I answered the phone, and, he was calling to tell me he had just gotten out of the hospital. He had quadruple bypass surgery, and we were talking, and I said, well, and when I left, let me back up. When I left, I didn't tell anybody I was leaving. I didn't tell, my daughter knew, of course, because I came out here with her, and my brother knew, and my mom they're out in Texas, but I didn't even tell my dad because I didn't ever talk to my dad. We lived in the same town. He never called, I never heard from him. So I didn't tell him. And so that day when he called, I said, well, Dad, I have something to tell you. And he says, what's that? And I said, well, I don't live in Arkansas anymore. He goes, you don't? Well, where are you? And I said, well, I moved out here to Las Vegas, to be closer to Emily and her family. And, me and my ex are getting a divorce and that sort of thing. And he was intrigued. And we went on and we talked a little bit longer, and he was, okay, well, I'll talk to you soon. And I said, okay. And I didn't think nothing else about it. A few days later, he called back. And a few days later, he called back. And some time, a little bit more time went on, and he called back. And I, at that point, was going, okay, what is going on? Okay, because my dad doesn't ever do this unless he wants something. So he must really want something from me, because he's just calling and calling and calling. But something in the back of my mind kept telling me, Denise, you need to do this. You need to talk to your dad. You need to answer these phone calls. You need to talk to him. And I did. And the more I talked to him, the more I realized he didn't want anything except to talk to me. And this went on for several months. In June of that year, 2021, my mom went into a nursing home, and I can remember calling my dad up the next day, because he knew mom had dementia and all that, and by this point he's remarried, and mom and dad were divorced, and so I called Dad the day that after she went to the nursing home, and I'm crying my eyes out, y'all, because it broke my heart. I love my mom, and her having dementia has been one of the hardest things ever, because me and mom have an amazing relationship. We're very, very close, and I just haven't been able to talk to her the way I used to, because she's not the same person that she's not the mom that I knew. I was really struggling with this, and I called my dad, and I said, Dad, I said, I don't know what to do. I said, because for the first time in my entire life, I have this problem that I don't know what to do about. And the one person I've always been able to call and talk to about, because I was struggling with mom, I said, I can't call her and ask her what to do. And at this point, I'm sobbing at this point. He didn't say anything for a second. There was a little bit of weird silence there. And all of a sudden, he says, Denise, there's nothing wrong with my mind. You can always call and talk to me. Y'all, I couldn't breathe. I was crying so hard. Because when somebody tells you they're sorry, it doesn't always say, I'm sorry. Sometimes I'm sorry says, Denise, there's nothing wrong with my mind. You can always call and talk to me. And that's when I knew my dad was just trying to make amends for not being there my whole life. He was trying to tell me I wasn't there, but now I am. This was in June. About a week or two later, he had to go to the hospital. He was having some stomach pain. And he called me, after he got back home, and he said, well, they went in and had to go in and put a stent in his, one of his bile ducts from his pancreas was blocked, and they had to go in and put a stent. He said, but Denise, when they went in, opened me up, they found a mass on my pancreas, and they sent it off for a biopsy, and we're waiting to get the results back. And it was a few days later, we got the results back that Dad had pancreatic cancer. I'm going to do a part 2. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I am so glad to be on this journey with you. I would love to know how you're chasing your dreams, so be sure to send me a message and let me know. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss another episode. And until next time, sis, go and live your best life.